Hello there, we're at the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, just a week away from the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And with me is its Vice President, Ralph Rayner. Ralph, thank you very much for joining us. Just taking a look over the past 10 years, what are the major changes that have happened in that time?
Well, in respect of ocean observations, I think the main change we've seen in that decade is the beginnings of maturity in our capacity to routinely observe and forecast the oceans. Up until a decade ago, much of that was in the realm of experiment and prototypes, and people just developing ideas and testing them. But we're now seeing real capacity to regularly and routinely observe the oceans from space and from instruments in the oceans, and to use that information to generate real, usable, societally useful pieces of information on a routine and regular basis. So that, to me, is the big change. And of course, in the last decade, we've also seen some really very, very important societal issues which are extremely relevant to understanding the oceans. We have the issue of climate and the role of the oceans in driving climate, which we need to fully understand. And we have the issue of the oceans as a potential source, well, they already are a source of vast reserves of energy, but a potential source of vast reserves of renewable energy. So we have this interplay of these two issues to consider. So it's very timely that our capacity to observe is beginning to become mature enough to start to address some of those issues.
How big a challenge has it been to tread that very fine line between climate change and energy security?
That's a very difficult balance to strike, but perhaps the oceans provide us with an opportunity to strike that balance. The oceans have, for the last 4 or 5 decades, been one of the primary sources of energy in the form of exploiting oil and gas beneath the sea floor. But perhaps in the future, the oceans give us another opportunity to start to replace those sources of energy with sources of renewable energy, and thereby get that balance between energy security and having an acceptable climate in the future, and an acceptable climate for future generations.
It's worth pointing out that you've literally just come back from the climate change conference at Copenhagen. How optimistic, if that's the right word, or how positive do you feel after that?
Well, I remain optimistic because I'm optimistic by nature, but I have to say that I left the Copenhagen meeting not exactly pessimistic, but certainly very upset with the outcome, that after all the time spent in preparing for a meeting that should have led to something much more substantial, we're still only one important step forward, but only one step forward, and the amount of time left in which to respond to these challenges is diminishing all the time, and the cost of response, for the longer the delay, the greater the cost. So I'm disappointed that we've missed an opportunity, and we've got to now build on what has been achieved to something that will actually do the job.
You talk of the greater the cost. I assume you mean the financial cost, but it's not just financial.
Well, the
cost,
financial and
is it?
No, it's the financial and the human cost. I mean, ultimately, any delay is going to lead to human cost. But it's most definitely the case that any delay is going to lead to a substantial financial penalty. The longer you leave it, the more it's going to cost.
And in terms of your industry specifically, how well do you think the marine industry is responding
to the specific challenge
of climate change?
Of delivering, I think the industry is responding very well. Our problem is whether governments are setting the framework that allows industry to deliver to its capacity. You take the marine renewables area, there's the capacity to already, in technological terms, to deliver a lot of the renewable energy sources that will, at least in part, substitute for fossil fuels. The challenge is having a legislative framework within which those alternatives are properly encouraged, and encouraged at a pretty rapid pace if we're going to hit our obligations, certainly in the European arena, our renewables obligations in the UK and in other European countries.
In terms of ocean observation, what challenges do you think lie ahead specifically over the next 10 years?
Well, I think if we pick up on the two themes we've just discussed of climate change and marine renewable energy, in the climate change arena, the ocean observation community is going to have to deliver the sustained observations that allow us to understand what's happening to the ocean climate over the next decade and to put us into a position to better forecast what will happen in the future. And that means we've got to develop instruments that are robust, that can be deployed for very long periods, making continuous observations of all sorts of different parameters. And there's lots of exciting new technologies appearing to do that. Gliders that can make observations below the sea surface for many months at a time. Those sorts of technologies need to mature and go into operational use to answer the questions that ultimately are going to be posed by treaty obligations. We need to understand how the oceans moderate climate, how they moderate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and in turn how that take-up of greenhouse gases impacts on the ocean environment itself. So there's all the issues of ocean acidification and understanding that and what its impact will be on the ocean environment.
Don't we already know all that information though, or maybe just not in enough detail?
I think there's a general perception, particularly amongst politicians, that we probably already know the answers. I think that's far from the truth. If I told you, for example, that the number of observations we have of the temperature of the deep ocean, that is the ocean below about 2,000 metres, are still incredibly sparse, only a few tens of locations around the entire planet where we have continuous observations. So there are whole volumes of the ocean that we know very, very little about still.
You'll be heading the Ocean Observation and Forecasting Conference stream at Oceanology International 2010. Could you just give us an idea of what some of the papers will include?
We've tried to put together a programme that really covers two main areas. That covers the plans for building operational systems, so putting lots of different technologies together to deliver operational products. And then another component that looks at the individual technologies, so specific developments of particular measurement tools that contribute to those overall systems. So it's both of those aspects.
What are you hoping to get out of Oceanology International 2010?
I'm hoping that we have an audience that goes away with a better awareness of what's happening in this whole ocean observation arena, with manufacturers that see a lead to what they should be focusing on in terms of developments of new instruments and sensors, to intermediate users who use ocean data to create specific products, for them to go away with a good understanding of what they're going to have available to them over perhaps the next decade, that they can use as the basis for building useful products. And then of course the ultimate users of that information going away with a real understanding of what might be possible and what might not be possible in that period.
Well, I hope it goes well for you, Ralph Rayner. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.